Chapter 1. 1.1. Dimensions of climate change and the gender gap. I think the link between gender and climate change is not necessarily obvious to most people. In all societies, women and girls are like the canary in the coal mine. A lot can be said about the health and stability of a society based on the quality of life of women. Women and girls are some of the most vulnerable categories of people who not only have to cope with the adverse effects of climate change, but actually have to adapt their lives to cope with it. Dr. Maisha Alam, Climate Crisis Development Expert, Senior Fellow, United Nations Center for Policy Research. Gender inequality coupled with the climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges of our time. It poses threats to the livelihoods, health, safety, and security of women and girls around the world. However, historically, climate change scientists, researchers, and policymakers have struggled to make the vital connections between gender, social equity, and climate change. As more and more data and research reveal their clear correlation, it is time to talk about the disparate impacts of climate change and the links between women's empowerment and effective global climate action. Who pollutes more? Climate change threatens the social, economic, and ecological systems of our planet. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, documents evidence of far-reaching impacts on freshwater resources, food, forest products, coastal systems, low-lying areas, industry, settlements, society, and human health. However, there is evidence that suggests that men contribute more to the pollution than women. For example, a study carried out by two researchers from the Swedish Defence Research Agency, FOI, in Stockholm, Sweden. To reach this conclusion, Rita Rati and Annika Karlsson-Kanyamar have compared the energy consumption of men and women in 4 European countries: Sweden, Norway, Germany, and Greece. The results show that single men consume on average more than single women in the 4 countries: in Norway, 6% more, in Germany, 8% more, in Sweden, 22% more, and in Greece, 39% more. According to the researchers, this is explained by the higher level of spending by men in the 4 European countries, but also by differences in consumption habits. Karlsson-Kanyamar adds, "I am surprised that more studies have not been done on gender differences in environmental impact. There are quite clear differences, and they are not likely to disappear in the near future." Although the differences in consumption habits between genders can have a very different relevance and can vary between countries, for the researchers the gap in energy expenditure in transport is too great not to be statistically significant in the 4 nations analyzed. Norwegians and Germans consume 70–80% more energy in transport than women, Swedes 100% more, and Greeks 350% more. According to the researchers, all this information may be of great interest to promote more efficient consumption habits and energy savings. Environmental policies should differentiate between genders, especially transportation. Campaigns could focus more on men to be more effective, says Karlsson-Kanyamar. Who is more affected? The climate crisis is not gender-neutral either. Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, which amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and security. Girls and women, especially those living in the global south, have unequal responsibility for food, water, energy, and other vital resources, as well as for the care of the young and the elderly, all of which put them at greater risk of harm and climate impacts. For example, girls and women often suffer the most during heat waves, droughts, severe storms, or other extreme weather events. They bear the burden of traveling further to collect scarce food, water, and firewood, and are often forced to stay in disaster-prone areas to care for the vulnerable. Agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and lower middle-income countries. During periods of drought and erratic rainfall, women, as agricultural workers and primary buyers, work harder to secure income and resources for their families. This puts additional pressure on girls, who often have to drop out of school to help their mothers manage the increased burden. And the February 2022 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, also states that girls and women are also at greater risk of food insecurity than boys and men, are more likely to die in extreme weather events, and to experience mental health impacts caused by climate change. Did you know? Why do we care so much about the IPCC report? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an advisory body to the United Nations. Its task is to provide those in power with up-to-date knowledge about climate change. The reports prepared by the IPCC are a common starting point for representatives of all countries in international negotiations on reducing human impact on the climate, adaptation to new conditions, compensation and assistance for countries particularly vulnerable to the effects of global warming, or in need of support in expanding the economy in a way that is safe for the future of the planet. Nominated by governments and observer organizations, the authors are a diverse group of experts, primarily scientists, but also representatives of industry or non-profit organizations from many cultural circles. Draft reports are subject to an open review process. Anyone willing can take part in it and make sure that the study takes into account all research on particular topics, and correctly presents the conclusions drawn from them. All this means that the content of the IPCC reports can be treated as an expression of knowledge-based scientific consensus, and the reports themselves as the best source of information on the climate. In its latest summary report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC writes more strongly than before about the relationship between global warming and human activity, narrows the possible range of climate sensitivity, and warns about the approaching crossing of the thresholds for temperature increase by 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial times. Reducing emissions could limit the temperature increase in the coming decades. As Dr. Valerie Masson-Delmotte, co-chair of the IPCC's first working group, points out, every half degree matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. Who fights climate change? According to the study Agenda, Values and Environmentalism, published in the scientific journal Social Science Quarterly, women value altruism more than men, which makes them more likely to care about nature and help to fight climate change. The Triple J radio station survey also revealed that 4 out of 5 listeners have changed some things in their lives in the last year to benefit the environment, and among them, 89% were girls while only 65% boys took that step. This survey only confirms other more professional studies, such as that of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CIRO. Claudia Benham, from James Cook University, said that women tend to be more concerned with and value the environment for its intrinsic value, and feel that impacts on the environment are more likely to affect them personally. Therefore, they are motivated to take action to improve the health of the environment. Furthermore, she believes that women and men interact with the environment in different ways, and what we know is that women, particularly in developed countries, are more susceptible to the impacts of climate change. Therefore, they tend to be more responsible for household activities that have an impact on the environment. Dr. Maisha Alam, an expert on the unfolding climate crisis who is a senior fellow at the UN Policy Research Center, says of women, they are at the front line of the fight against climate change, and leaving them out of the conversation is a missed opportunity both for effective policy making and for tackling climate change. Case studies. Kenya. The Green Belt Movement. The GBM, Green Belt Movement, is a grassroots non-governmental entity, based in Kenya, focused on environmental protection and community training and development. The origins of this great organization go back to June 5, 1976, World Environment Day, when Professor Wangari Maathai, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, under the auspices of the National Council of Women of Kenya, then called Maendeleo ya Wanawake, symbolically planted 7 tree saplings in the Kamkunji area, on the outskirts of the city of Nairobi. These saplings honored 2 women and 5 men for the various and significant contributions each had made to the community over the course of their lives. Humble as its origins, the WBG simply wanted to deck the country with belts of trees. The WBG's aspiration is to create a society of people who consciously work for the permanent improvement of their natural environment, and for a greener and cleaner country. Its mission is to promote community awareness in pursuit of greater self-determination, equity, a more stable livelihood, and environmental protection. The movement is guided by values such as voluntarism, love for the natural environment, a willingness to self-improvement, accountability, and transparency. The Green Belt movement has planted more than 51 million trees in Kenya since its founding, and has set its sights on restoring the degraded Sahel region, an 8,000-kilometer-wide stretch of land on the African continent. It also trained more than 30,000 women in forestry, food processing, beekeeping and other trades that help them earn an income while preserving their livelihoods. Land and natural resources. Through the GBM, Kenyan communities have been educated in preventing and reducing environmental destruction, as well as in recovering areas that had been damaged. Exemplary woman in the field of climate action, Wangari Maathai, Woman Tree. A biologist, environmentalist, and tireless political activist, whose vision was to unite ecology and sustainable development with democracy, human rights, and women's empowerment. As said before, based on the idea that environmentalism could be a way to achieve sustainable development and ameliorate Kenya's problems, Wangari Maathai founded the Green Belt movement in 1977. She encouraged women to go into the forest and collect seeds from trees native to the area and then create greenhouses, for which the women received a stipend. These seeds were then used to plant trees. It was a simple idea to encourage women to work together to plant trees to improve their own situation and fight deforestation, erosion, and drought. Just because women were the ones who were trained in ecology, had leadership roles, ran the nurseries, and worked with foresters planning and implementing projects for water harvesting and food security, the movement was key to advancing the emancipation and empowerment of women farmers. 1.2. Gender inequality in environmental and natural resources management and biodiversity. Promoting gender equality and women's empowerment creates sustainable benefits for households and communities while improving human and environmental health and welfare outcomes. However, many approaches to the environment have not been very gender sensitive. In fact, a gender gap is a gender-based inequality. It is any disparity in treatment or status between women and men, often rooted in social, cultural, and legal norms and customs. Gender gaps create barriers to effective sustainable development and livelihoods, by limiting or restricting women's access to resources and decision-making opportunities. In some cases, as we will see later on in this guide, violence may be used against women as a means of control over resources and opportunities, reinforcing power imbalances and gender inequality. Good governance in sustainable ecosystem management can only be achieved by understanding gender gaps and addressing specific barriers. Without doing so, sustainable ecosystem management approaches risk exacerbating gender inequality to the detriment of conservation goals, community well-being, and human rights. The following are examples of critical gender gaps that present barriers to sustainable ecosystem management. Access and ownership. Gender roles and norms influence access to and use of natural resources. Evidence attributes numerous environmental restoration benefits to women's access to and management of land. However, structural inequalities often limit women's land ownership and access to natural resources. Did you know that? Globally, only about 13.8% of women own land, and in sub-Saharan Africa only 14.2% of women own some land. Women's land holdings tend to be smaller and of lower quality than men's, although there are more women than men working in agriculture and natural resource management, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. It is important to create opportunities for equitable access to and ownership of land, and to support women's capacity to make appropriate investments to support local food systems, ensure nutrition and food security, and diversify into other sustainable livelihood options. This requires urgent gender-sensitive programmatic and policy action and support from all development partners. The UN Millennium Project suggests the following areas that could help increase women's access to land. Reform laws and support women's claim to joint ownership and titling in the name of both partners. Collective approaches to support women's access to land. International action in support of national movements for women's property and inheritance rights. Also, a recent report by the aforementioned Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reaffirmed that strengthening women's access to and control over land improves sustainable management efforts, for example by increasing investments and willingness to engage in conservation activities, including tree planting and sustainable land management. Inclusive participation and decision-making. While women continue to lead efforts in natural resource and biodiversity management, they lack meaningful participation, leadership, and representation in decision-making at all levels. For example, men still occupy 67% of climate-related decision-making roles. Women's representation in national and global climate negotiating bodies remains below 30%. Women represent less than 25% of all national parliamentarians worldwide. This underrepresentation also extends to environmental decision-making at the national level, where women hold only 12% of key ministerial positions in environment-related sectors worldwide, as well as in district or community-level committees, where women are generally underrepresented. Women's needs, priorities, and knowledge have not been adequately considered. This limits their roles and knowledge to effectively contribute to the management of natural resources and ecosystems. Women's leadership and full participation in the climate movement are essential if we are to design solutions and responses to the climate emergency that address women's differentiated needs and protect their rights. In fact, at the national and international level, countries with more women parliamentarians are more likely to ratify environmental treaties. At the community level, for example in India and Nepal, forest management groups that included women showed better results in governance and resource conservation. It is essential that international program designers ensure that innovations, technologies, and practices are designed to reduce women's inequality, which has been a serious constraint to women's meaningful participation and decision-making. For example, innovations that would reduce rural women's heavy burden of water, fuelwood collection, weeding, and harvesting would free up their time and provide them with opportunities to diversify their livelihoods and improve their well-being. However, it is also important to ensure that we do not fall into tokenism. What is it? Tokenism comes from token, and is used to refer to the symbolic inclusion that consists of making small and superficial concessions to minority groups in order to avoid accusations of prejudice and discrimination. Constructing evidence of gender transformation. There is a great opportunity to capture and effectively communicate the impact of work to promote women's and men's equal access, ownership, decision-making, and participation in natural resource management. The process of capturing gender-related impact is challenging, and requires specific tools and skills to understand the complex long-term processes of transformational development. It calls for going beyond sex disaggregation to incorporate both quantitative and qualitative data to assess policies, norms, relationships, attitudes, perceptions, and other factors that account for gender-differentiated needs and priorities. This approach is also fully in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG number 5, gender equality, which requires sex disaggregated data as well as quantitative data by gender to track progress on the goals. This is a political process that requires intentionality and resources. Case studies. Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, World Vision's Hwambo project partnered with local government and cooperatives to build consensus on women's participation early in the project formulation phase, and facilitated the development of bylaws that ensured benefit sharing to all those who had contributed their labor. The Hwambo project made an explicit effort to include female heads of households and women dependent on the exploitation of degraded community forests and wooded areas during the initial year of area closure for regeneration, which has improved women's participation in the forest management groups and the cooperative platform. With increased access to forest products such as timber, trees, pasture, and water from the revitalized ecosystem, women began to actively participate in harvesting, selling, and generating new income for the household. Women's decision-making on the use of income also improved household food security. Mixed resource management. Women's access to and/or title to land have resulted in environmentally sustainable and climate-resilient natural resource management practices, such as tree planting, improved soil fertility and water harvesting, which contribute to food security, livelihoods, and incomes. A study from the Amazon region shows that securing land rights for indigenous women and men contributes to reducing deforestation rates and is a cost-effective measure for climate change mitigation. Another landmark study by Bina Ugawal explored the impact of women's participation in community forest governance, and showed that mixed groups of men and women have the highest rates of forest recovery compared to groups of men or women. Ugawal found that when women actively participate in these groups, when they have influence and are properly heard, it leads to better governance, less conflict, more compliance, better patrolling, better enforcement, and better welfare outcomes. 1.3. Gender in disaster risk reduction. Well-designed disaster risk reduction and climate change initiatives that provide for women's full and effective participation can promote substantive gender equality and women's empowerment, while ensuring that the goals of sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate change are met. Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Recommendation 37. Gender is an important factor in determining vulnerability and capacity to mitigate climate impacts. A UN Women and UNICEF 2019 study focusing on women's missing voices in disaster risk reduction (DRR) efforts confirmed that gender norms and barriers to their participation affect women's vulnerability to disasters. Women's higher rates of illiteracy, lower rates of mobility, and limited access to communications technology, including radios and mobile phones through which early warnings tend to be communicated, increase their vulnerability. Men also tend to be seen as decision makers in the household, which can put women at risk. In some cases, women stay at home because their husbands have decided not to evacuate or to wait for their husbands to return before leaving. Due to gender-specific roles and expectations, women are more likely to be at home when disaster risks arise and take responsibility for evacuating their family to safety. Did you know that? Women are much more likely than men to die in a natural disaster. Particularly in countries where women have low social status and lack access to resources, the difference was larger, while in countries with more or less equal rights for women and men the difference was negligible. Numea and Pluemper, 2007. A study in Nepal found that 71% of men received early warning information through a formal source, such as the government or non-governmental organizations, NGOs, while 51% of women received their information through informal social sources, such as word of mouth from the community or family. 70% of the 15,000 people in France who died in 2003 in heatwaves were women, OG, 2005, and 4 times as many men died in the tsunami-affected areas of Indonesia, Sri Lanka and India in 2004, Oxfam, 2005. According to the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, a number of studies revealed that during the disasters in Bangladesh, female mortality in the age group 20 to 49 years was 4 to 5 times higher than male mortality. However, there were also cases where male mortality may be higher, as men are often more likely to be involved in rescue activities during disasters and thus face higher risks. UNDP, 2008. In addition, after a disaster, women tend to be more susceptible to stress-related disorders, depression and gender-based violence. Sellers, 2016, World Health Organization, 2011, Buckingham, 2015. These gender-related differences are the result of structural inequalities, not biological differences. Only through better understanding and planning for these differentiated experiences can these socio-cultural factors and structural inequalities be addressed to deliver the right climate action. Women for Climate. Recommendations for strengthening community-level resilience to disasters with gender inclusion. Incorporate targeted disaster risk management activities into community-based programs, e.g. conditional cash transfer programs in the Philippines include family and community disaster preparedness, as part of family development sessions. Develop community education and awareness raising on disaster risk initiatives and resilience building measures through radio spots, text messages, campaigns, and street theater, especially targeting women and girls in rural communities. Use informal games, competitions, publications, and preparedness drills to engage girls in schools in disaster preparedness strategies. Conduct a separate community mapping with women and girls to identify vulnerabilities as well as existing resources, e.g. community assets that can be used as evacuation camps and services. Regularly update mapping exercises such as vulnerabilities and capacities. Identify critical facilities such as evacuation sites, emergency shelter facilities, and water, sanitation, and health facilities accessible to both women and men. Establish a community information board to display information in local languages and with illustrations. Ensure that local government disaster risk management plans include gender-inclusive elements such as gender-inclusive risk and vulnerability assessment and/or capacity analysis, and targets for women participation in the development of risk and hazard maps, community-based risk management procedures and preparedness and response activities, development of post-disaster recovery action plans and monitoring and/or warning activities. Support community mechanisms to enable the inclusion of women's participation in local disaster risk management committees. Train women to conduct vulnerability and risk assessment, safe construction techniques, and routine maintenance of houses, factories, schools, and community assets for disaster resilience features. Support the development of skills in coping strategies that would facilitate women and girls in disaster situations, e.g. swimming lessons in flood-prone areas, and preparation of emergency bags in earthquake-prone areas. Establish a gender-sensitive early warning system using communication channels that are easily understood. Recommendations for the reconstruction of community infrastructure. Establish women's communal spaces in safe and accessible locations. These spaces can be a place for women to participate in confidential psychosocial counseling sessions, liaise with disaster response service providers, and engage in livelihood skills development sessions. Women's common spaces can also be used by survivors of GBV to access information and referral services in a confidential setting. Consult with women and girls in disaster-affected areas to identify the spatial design and location of such spaces. Train disaster-affected women to be coordinators of women's spaces, and link the spaces with activities identified by women in the community for their empowerment. Ensure that women are directly involved in decision-making and make local security arrangements. Provide capacity-building support to women in groups for participation in community facilities and management committees. Case studies. Pakistan. Gender-inclusive needs assessment. The Asian Development Bank and the World Bank led a gender-inclusive damage and needs assessment, following the massive floods in Pakistan in 2010. The needs assessment examined the devastation and identified key recovery and rehabilitation needs. The assessment was based on data collected from separate focus group discussions with displaced women and men living in relief camps, along with interviews with key observers such as teachers, aid workers, village leaders, and representatives of non-governmental organizations. Post-disaster needs confirmed that pre-existing gender inequalities in Pakistan had been exacerbated after the floods, and that the trend was expected to continue. In particular, the evaluation identified that many women and girls felt a loss of honor and dignity due to the lack of privacy in the camps. Several suffered from severe malnutrition and poor hygiene conditions. Women had limited access to income, assets, or means of subsistence, and increased vulnerability to violence against women and girls. Based on the results of the needs assessment, the following gender issues for reconstruction emerged. A. The inclusion of women in the reconstruction process. B. Professional jobs for women. C. Gender-sensitive facilities, such as vocational schools for women and health clinics, and D. Gender-sensitive facilities, such as vocational schools for women and health clinics. D. Land acquisition by women. Sri Lanka. Gender-inclusive assistance for tsunami-affected people. In tsunami-affected areas of Sri Lanka, many women had to take on the role of head of household along with their children, traditional domestic and caring roles and responsibilities. The Asian Development Bank's reconstruction project incorporated gender-inclusive design features to ensure that these women actively participated in the project and had access to livelihood options, such as employment in small-scale community infrastructure, reconstruction, provision of training and support to establish livelihood enterprises. In the next implementation project, women earned relatively higher incomes as a result of training, livelihood programs, loans provided through women's organizations, and establishment of product marketing centers. The project also assisted women with the replacement of essential documents, such as national identity cards, birth certificates, and land titles, lost in the tsunami. 1.4. Gender and agroecology, girls and young women within rural world. At the beginning of the 20th century, only 2% of the world's population lived in cities. Whereas in 2000, the corresponding percentage was 50%, some estimates suggest that, if the picture remains unchanged, by 2050 this figure could be as high as 75%, Chu, 2008. This disproportionate process of urban sprawl has even been referred to as, from the Greek polis to the metropolis, megalopolis, parasitopolis of unbridled capitalism, and even pathopolis of large agglomerations, and, finally, in the full imaginary of collapse, the necropolis, Tibwa, 2017, citing Paquette. The causes of depopulation include the disappearance or deterioration of public services and infrastructure, stagnation or lack of employment, the aging and masculinization of the rural population together with the exodus of young people, lack of incentives and aid to maintain family agri-food businesses, etc. The last decade has seen an increase in the number of social economy organizations extending their scope of action to rural areas. There has been an increase in projects and programs promoted by organizations with the aim of improving the quality of life in the rural world in order to better respond to their needs and access to services, very often neglected by public entities. Moreover, in the face of the civilizational crisis that we are already beginning to experience, A greater trend of exodus towards the rural world is foreseen, quite contrary to the trend mentioned above and observed until now. Hence the role of these social economy organizations will be even greater, so that coexistence is based on cooperation, and not under the rules of macroeconomics or every man for himself. Gomez-Granell, 2020. Moreover, in the era of politically considering the rural and natural world as a mere source of resources, or space for unwanted infrastructures in the cities, in recent years several initiatives driven by the social economy have also helped with rural depopulation. These actions should be supported, not criticized, by the public sector to avoid returning to the mistakes that have led to the agonizing state of the rural environment today. Along the same lines, a shortcoming that has often been linked to social economy organizations has been their territorial dispersion. However, if they are well managed, this supposed disadvantage can easily become a great attribute by allowing greater capillarity of the scope of action, greater proximity and a better response to the more specific needs of their populations and their natural environment. Crespo, 2013. Also, how are women in rural areas affected? It seems demonstrable that agroecology, permaculture and bio-intensive micro-agriculture allow yields comparable to, if not higher than, those of industrial agriculture, albeit on small areas, while reducing climate impacts and enabling the settlement of farming communities. Servin and Stevens, 2020. Escobar, 2017 recalls that the highly respected in the eco-feminist movement, Indian physicist and philosopher Vandana Shiva called the key to the transition in this sector from oil to soil, referring to the shift from a mechanistic industrial paradigm centered on globalized markets to one that is people and planet-centered, relocalized, decentralized and based on biodiversity, democracy, local economies, soil preservation and ecological integrity. Moreover, women farmers play a key role in local seed systems, yet they are often overlooked by researchers and development staff, policies and programs. Climate change is putting pressure on farmers' seed and food production systems, often resulting in different impacts on women and men. Conservation and diversification of crops and varieties can be effective adaptation strategies to respond to changing agricultural conditions and increased uncertainty. Women are at the forefront of implementing these new strategies, but more attention and support is needed from research and development agencies and practitioners. In many developing countries, the collection of water and fuel is a large part of the work done mainly by women. UN Women estimated that women and children in Africa spend 40 billion hours a year collecting water, 2005. In much of sub-Saharan Africa, most urban households rely on traditional fuels such as charcoal, wood and straw for cooking. UN Habitat, 2009. For example, in South Africa, a substantial proportion of households in informal settlements have to obtain their water off-site. In more than 50% of households, mostly young women and girls are responsible for time-consuming water collection. Lack of sanitation in schools, including lack of toilets, insufficient water for personal use and washing, safe and private spaces and drainage to avoid flooding from sewage, is one of the most important reasons why girls often drop out of school and do not complete primary education. Exemplary woman in the field of climate action, Vandana Shiva. The aforementioned physicist, philosopher, and writer. In 1982 she created the Foundation for Scientific, Technological and Ecological Research to protect biodiversity and, specifically, seeds, in the face of the expansive and privatizing practices of Monsanto, the corporation that imposes its genetically modified seeds. She is also one of the founders of the Gender Unit at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMED, and of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. She chairs the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture, Tuscany, Italy, and is a member of the World Future Council and the board of the International Forum on Globalization. Time magazine has defined her as an environmental heroine, and she is the author of numerous reference books on ecofeminism, including Who Really Feeds the World, Making Peace with the Earth, Earth Democracy, Soil Not Oil, Staying Alive, Stolen Harvest, Water Wars and Globalization's New Wars. She has received more than 20 international awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, considered the Alternative Nobel Prize, 1993, the John Lennon Yoko Ono Fellowship for Peace, 2008, the Sydney Peace Prize, 2010, and the Calgary Peace Prize, 2011. Robin Wall Kimmerer. Botanist, writer, and distinguished professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in New York. She is the director and founder of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs that blend indigenous and scientific knowledge to shared sustainability goals. In collaboration with tribal partners, she has an active research program in the ecology and restoration of plants of cultural importance to the native people. She collaborates with initiatives to expand access to environmental science education for indigenous students, and to create new models for the integration of indigenous philosophy and scientific tools. She participates in programs that present the benefits of traditional ecological knowledge to the scientific community. GenerA is co-founder and past chair of the Ecological Society of America's section on traditional ecological knowledge. Of European and Anishinaabe descent, she is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. As a writer and scientist, her interests encompass not only the restoration of ecological communities, but also the restoration of our relationships with the land. 1.5. Case Studies. Spain. In Spain, the NGO Ecologistas en Action recognized that it was necessary to adapt the petro-dependent agro-food model to a model of ecological, local and small-scale production, giving priority to the food sovereignty of the territories. 2011. In order to do this, they invite to 1. Promote population movement to rural areas and increase self-sufficiency in cities, by removing legal barriers to agroecological production by small-scale farmers. 2. Facilitate the rural population's access to land and other infrastructures necessary for production, processing centers, shared machinery, etc. and reproduction, housing, schools, health centers, etc. 3. Promote agricultural uses without pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. 4. Rapidly reduce the irrigated area by replacing irrigated crops with rain-fed crops. 5. Increase investment in R&D in agroecological production systems and recovery of traditional knowledge. 6. Reversing the process of productive specialization by integrating agriculture and livestock farming to close cycles and recovering productive and landscape diversity. 7. Urgently halt the process of soil loss and promote the recovery of soil organic matter and biological balance. 8. Encourage a decrease in the consumption of animal-based foodstuffs, especially meat. 9. Encourage the creation of seed banks in order to recover and conserve traditional and local seed varieties, allowing farmers to freely use, conserve and commercialize them. 10. Prohibit the unconfined use of genetically modified organisms, under the principle of caution. 11. Promote community health and care systems, avoiding that the female population is mostly responsible for these tasks. 12. Reorient health systems towards a comprehensive approach focusing on health promotion and primary prevention of diseases, taking into account not only individual habits but also socio-economic contexts. 13. Ban the manufacture and use of toxic substances, materials, and articles. 14. Promote green chemistry, clean and safe consumer products and industrial processes. A lifelike fiberglass sculpture by artist Ruben Orozco in the Nervión River in Bilbao, Spain, draws attention to the human cost of the climate crisis. Not accidentally, the sculpture represents a female. As a practical example, the Spanish cooperatives associated with Federación Cooperatives Agroalimentarias de la Comunidad Valenciana have a total of 192,385 members, with a growing 40% increase since 2015 participation of women, 28% whose presence in decision-making bodies is being encouraged, 8% today. In addition, cooperatives contribute to employment in rural areas. In 2017, agri-food cooperatives in the Spanish Valencian community provided 20,000 direct jobs and, moreover, jobs of quality and stability. Above all, thanks to the vast majority of permanent contracts, 76%. Moreover, the Valencian agri-food cooperative sector is characterized by small, family-run entities and a presence even in rural areas considered to be depopulated. However, globalization and climate change have not left the sector unaffected, both in terms of new trade implications and plant health and diversity. We are facing a reckoning, which will be none other than the moment when history will decide whether, as a species, we are able to work together and find a way to coexist on this planet, or whether, on the contrary, we must disappear and make way for evolution, which will do without us. We rural dwellers have a lot to say in this decision. Likewise, the social economy is an indispensable tool, Gomez-Granell, 2020. United Kingdom. Another example of a just social and ecological rural action could be the transition movement founded in Great Britain in 2006, which has thousands of projects on all continents, be it renewable energy production cooperatives, local and sustainable food systems, permaculture farms, etc. In short, it is a proposal for a new system that makes the old one obsolete and seeks to build local resilience, i.e., to increase local and rural capacity on the basis of energy descent and degrowth, voluntary simplicity, fair sharing and rationing, Servin and Stevens, 2020. The transition movement is thus seen as a grand social experiment of adapting to the limits of the planet, and facing a collective process of transition towards a more local and self-sufficient future. Why? The key question being asked is, what will our environment be in the future without fossils but with a vibrant regional economy and meaningful social life? And, more importantly, what can be done now to initiate this transition? Since the first initiative, the Transition Town Totnes in the southwest of England, a colourful portfolio of very diverse approaches has emerged, but with a common goal and ethos, Burkhardt et al., 2020. Today there are several thousands of transition initiatives in 50 countries, and research shows that initiatives thrive better in small towns than in big cities. In Totnes, the way has been paved for active relocation policies, the deployment of urban gardens, local currencies, cooperatives, the implementation of permaculture projects and, in short, resilience, Tibwa, 2017. One of its founders says that if they had waited for governments, they would not have arrived in time, and if they had acted as individuals, it would not have been enough, but by acting as a community, they hope to reach the eco-social transition in time. It also requires a good dose of will, a dash of boldness and a drop of naivety. In fact, the success of the transition movement is due to the fact that the participants adopt a positive vision of the future. In order not to fall into depression, they imagine, together, a future with the horizon of 2030, without oil and with an uncontrolled climate, but where life will not be bad, Servin and Stevens, 2020. To sum up, rural areas are often far from population centers, poorly communicated, affected by changes in the economic and climatic situation. There is certainly room for improvement in terms of coordination between social economy organizations and the public sector, with the contributions and participation of the inhabitants of the villages themselves. This is confirmed by the Third Sector Radiography Report, 2018, which highlights that for better sustainability and stability, this collaboration with public bodies will be a key factor. It will therefore be necessary to better integrate the strategies of social economy organizations with those of other sectors. This also requires improving the work of social awareness, continuous information in the media, improving educational curricula, greater eco-responsible ethics, inclusion of cultural and scientific aspects, and fostering citizen empowerment and participation in terms of policy proposals and monitoring, Prats et al., 2017. Solutions to the deficit of basic infrastructures, the other handicap of the rural environment, and, along the same lines, the high difficulties of access to quality public services, together with the attraction of young talent, the neo-rural, especially female talent, and their professionalization, are also part of the proposals for improvement, Medina, 2020. Practical exercise for young people 1. Group discussion, plenary. Objective: to understand the different ways in which socially ascribed roles in society determine the ways in which women experience the impacts of climate-induced resource scarcity. Time, 10 minutes, video presentation Sisters of the Planet Martina, Uganda. 20 minutes, group discussion and reflection. Facilitators' notes. Encourage a discussion on the central theme and presentation of the video. Encourage a discussion on the question, does climate change have a gender-differentiated impact? Encourage participants to discuss gender-based experiences in their own contexts. Practical exercise for young people 2. Holiday snaps. Objectives. 1. To explore where images of the Global South come from through a visualization exercise. 2. To introduce the idea that our images of the Global South are one-dimensional through a discussion of the types of images produced. Note, this activity focuses specifically on Africa, but any region or country could be used. Time, 20 minutes. Materials, blank paper. Art materials, crayons, markers, colored pencils. Flip chart, a whiteboard and markers. Facilitator's notes. 1. The facilitator asks participants to get comfortable and close their eyes for a mental journey. 2. The facilitator asks participants to imagine the following. Imagine that you are in Africa, picture your surroundings. What time of day is it? What is the weather like? What kinds of plants and animals can you see? As you walk through the scene, you see some people. What do they look like? What are they doing? You come to some houses. What do they look like? How big are they? What are they made from? You enter a house. What is it like inside? What are the people doing? Now you are back and can open your eyes. 3. Distribute the art supplies and paper. Ask participants to draw the scene that they had just imagined. Explain that there is no right or wrong, and encourage them not to compare their drawings until they are all finished. 4. Display the pictures around the room. If anyone is uncomfortable, they do not have to display their picture. 5. Facilitator should ask participants what the commonalities are among the pictures and list them on the flip chart or whiteboard. 6. Possible discussion questions include: is this an accurate portrayal of Africa? Would the people of Africa be happy with the way their continent is being portrayed? What about the girls and women in particular? What role does the media play in creating these images of Africa and other parts of the Global South? Follow-up, participants can look for images of the Global South in general media sources. The facilitator can provide alternative images of Africa.